I'm really happy to be here, and today I'm going to talk about digital ecosystems in competition law. And as a sort of spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you more about what I plan to do and what I have done, because I'm still in the first year of my project. But if I may rip up at your presentation, David, that gives a great moment for you to give me feedback, because it will be easier to prevent than to correct later on. So this is my topic, and I actually want to start in the tradition that Thibault establishes for all of his courses, with a movie. This is Inception by Christopher Nolan, and this movie encourages us to dream a little bigger. And I thought this was relevant to start my talk because for a long time, firms have dreamt rather small by today's standards, in the sense that they were organized around specialized pipelines that essentially were built in a single value chain. And value went from the manufacturer to the distributor and to the consumer. And competition law was created in this world in which the pipeline firm was the model of success, and therefore it operated well in this world. But today, I think that firms dream a little bigger than that. And instead of organizing production along a single value chain in a pipeline form, they tend to expand. And we've already seen this in the 70s and 80s when we had an expansion from the pipeline firm to the conglomerate model, where firms went horizontally and diagonally and in unrelated directions, but still using a command and control model. But what we see today is that digital ecosystems break these boundaries, and rather than using ownership to expand, they use strategic alliances and other forms of cooperation that are enabled by technology. And they create these ecosystems that benefit from all the factors that David mentioned in his presentation about digital markets, feedback loops, and network effects. And they tend to be self-reinforcing. So the question is, if we know that this digital ecosystem grow from really humble seeds, like the ideas in this will be, for instance, they grow from a core platform like Facebook, from a core product or service like an Apple phone or Apple iOS, or from a core technology, like for instance artificial intelligence, which is what we're seeing today, or blockchain. Is it right for us to intervene when that ecosystem is still being created? Or do we also or only need to intervene at a later stage, once we know what the value of the ecosystem is and also what the part of the ecosystem is? So in my talk today, I want to cover how do we wake up from the pipeline dream, and how do we use competition law in the realm in which digital ecosystems are the model of success? And I think you've all figured out already that the premise of my research is that digital ecosystems are the new form of business in the digital world. And I wanted to challenge myself to prove that. And one way to do it is to look at the top firms by market capitalization. And if we look at the 8 firms that currently are above the $1 trillion market cap, we see that 6 out of them are what are described usually as ecosystem firms, and they're all US based. Now, market capitalizations change because they reflect the deleterious action of the market, but the ratio is surprisingly solid and stable, because I found in a 2020 study by McKinsey the same mention, 6 out of the top 8 companies being digital ecosystems. So I think that these companies are relevant economically on the world stage, but they're also relevant on the small scale of the individual. For instance, Google has over 3 billion active devices at the moment, and Facebook has over 2 billion active daily users. And we see some ecosystems that are not even in the top by market capitalization, like TikTok and WeChat, that have a significant footprint. And I think we can all agree that these numbers are just illustrative and sort of the tip of the iceberg, because when we talk about the Google ecosystem, we're not talking only about devices. We're also talking about Google Search or Google Maps for the Google browser. And similarly for Facebook, it's not well, for Meta, it's not just Facebook, but also Instagram or WhatsApp. So I think apart from economic relevance, they also have quite a serious societal relevance. And that in turn means that they have enormous political relevance at the moment in our climates. And the political relevance, in my preliminary research, I group in 2 types of narratives. The first narrative, which is confusingly on the bottom of this slide, is the industrial policy narrative, which suggests that ecosystems are relevant for economic growth, for competitiveness on the global scale, and they are a source of internal security. So the industrial policy narrative seems to be pro-ecosystem, or at least pro certain kinds of ecosystems. On the other hand, competition policymakers tend to dream a little smaller, if I can say so, because they focus on ecosystems as a source of power for individual firms and monopoly concerns. And this seems to be an expansion of the narrative that we've seen around platforms and double-sided markets as a source of power for individual firms. As a competition law enthusiast, and my project is in competition law, I'm forced into this second perspective, but I doubt whether we can answer all competition law questions without at least grappling with the tension between the two views. So, because they were politically relevant, economically relevant, and socially relevant, digital ecosystems are also academically quite debated. And we can see that the term business ecosystem was introduced in 1993 by Moore and popularized in 2004, but the literature actually explodes after 2007. And the study that is mentioned there is a study that was actually commissioned by the European Commission and published by the European Commission's Publications Office. And that study is quite a relevant turning point because it marks a big departure in the literature, which from this point on takes two very different perspectives of the digital ecosystem. On the one hand, we have the perspective that the European Commission study puts forward, which is that digital ecosystems are akin to biological systems in the sense that they have properties like self-organization or openness or robustness. And on the other hand, we have the pre-existing literature on business ecosystems and subsequent literature on digital business ecosystems, which emphasizes an ecological view. And the key properties here are competition, value co-creation, and participation, among others. So these views are found completely irreconcilable in the sense that there are overlaps. Robustness is clearly mentioned in both, and some of the others can be overlapped. But in my view, there is a key difference that cannot be reconciled. And that is the fact that the same system cannot be both self-organizing on the one hand, and also orchestrated or organized by the keystone player or the ecosystem leader at the same time. So it's important to figure out what kind of system are we talking about before we decide how to regulate this. And this split can also lead to divergences further down the line, because we're not quite sure if the ecosystem is a way to describe an industry architecture that is already there, so we're looking more at the macro level, or whether it is a choice that firms make, which is the perspective that I started with and the perspective that the Commission seeks to adopt. That it's a business model and move away from a simple value chain around suppliers to a digital ecosystem. As if that's not enough, I think another difficulty is how do we integrate what we know about digital and software ecosystems with what we know about business ecosystems. Are we saying that a digital ecosystem is a normal business ecosystem which operates on these dynamic digital markets, which would imply that we're talking more about economies of scope, for example? Or are we saying that the digital ecosystem is any ecosystem on any market as long as it's supported by digital interconnectivity, which would imply that it generates economies of scale or efficiencies internally? And while we're trying to figure that out, the literature gives us all sorts of other types of ecosystems that might be informative, like the innovation ecosystem or the knowledge ecosystem. So there's quite a bit of confusion, at least when it comes to scholarly debate, about what is the object of our study, what units of analysis do we use, and what, therefore, are the actual conclusions that we can draw. But while we don't know what an ecosystem is, we might have some ideas about what an ecosystem is not, and that might be a way to solve this problem. And on the one hand, as I started from the beginning, we know that an ecosystem is not a conglomerate, because a conglomerate involves control and ownership of resources, whereas an ecosystem doesn't involve the ownership component, at least not over all the elements of the ecosystem. And we also know that an ecosystem isn't a platform. This is also made clear in the market definition notice by the Commission. But we're not quite clear in what the role of platforms are for ecosystems. Is a platform necessary for an ecosystem, or can you have one without a platform? And when you talk about platform, do you talk about the way in which the Commission does in the market definition notice, in the sense of a double-sided market? Or do you talk about the platform as a technical thing that supports the ecosystem? While we're trying to figure out these answers, it seems that the law is in this case running ahead of the literature and of the academic research, because the digital ecosystem concept is emerging quite strongly in recent years in law. It started in 2007 when the Commission referred to Amazon as a closed ecosystem, which posed not insurmountable barriers to entry, but significant enough barriers to give Amazon a competitive advantage. And in 2018, we have the Google Android decision from the Commission, which marks the first time that ecosystem leverage is used under one of two SMEs in the CARM. And that case is confirmed by the General Court in 2022. And in the 2022 decision, the General Court actually comes up with a definition of digital ecosystem that we'll look on in just a minute. 2023 is important, not just because we have the first use of that ecosystem theory to ban a merger in continuity travel die, but also because we have the first designations under the DMA. And the DMA has the ecosystem concept spread somewhere in its ethos, but not made explicit. And the European Commission uses this concept in only 11 out of 47 designation decisions. And interestingly, those 11 decisions concern Amazon, Apple, and Facebook, in addition to ByteDance, but they don't concern Google, which was the main target for ecosystem challenges prior. And in this 2023 decision against ByteDance is the parent company of TikTok. The problem was that the Commission found that they are a gatekeeper, even though they offer only one core platform service. They don't have multiple services like Google or Amazon. And even though they have this only one platform, they nevertheless have a multi-service ecosystem of integrating advertisement, content, and e-commerce. And the Commission's view was supported in 2024 by the General Court's decision in ByteDance, in which the General Court found a new definition of ecosystem based this time on the DMA and tried to align it a little bit, or as best as it could, with the definition from Google Android. And the same year, we have ecosystem concerns popping up in other cases, and we also have the Commission's market definition notice, which tells us that we now have to define ecosystem markets in some cases in which they might be relevant. And lastly, in 2025, which is this year, we have the Android Auto decision from the Court of Justice, in which we find out that an ecosystem can be an essential facility, and that access to an ecosystem can't be indefinitely prohibited, when that ecosystem is built to interact with others. So this emerging case law on the background of undecided scholarship leads to three problems. The first one is, how do we identify the digital ecosystem? The court and the Commission have definitions that look aligned, but when analyzed in more detail, revealed some key differences. For instance, is the ecosystem something that is driven by demand complementarity, or is it simply driven by interoperability? We also have issues because if we don't know how to define the boundaries of the ecosystem, how are we going to say what is the relevant market for the ecosystem? And the Commission says, well, we'll just use the aftermarket approach, but that's not entirely supported by the literature. And it also doesn't solve the question of whether an analytical framework is enough to decide when we are looking at single markets or ecosystem markets. And it also doesn't tell us whether we need to use additional tools that cross-disciplinary studies show might be useful. And the last problem is, what are the harms of the ecosystem? Because competition law is focused on the harms apparently and not the benefits. And in my research, I hope to be able to group them in these three categories. Harms related to building the ecosystem, to protecting or maintaining the ecosystem, and to exploiting the ecosystem. And this is just a very girly mapping, but I hope to add more cases to this framework as I go along my research. So Well, to wrap up this whole introduction, my research questions are: what is a digital ecosystem? What ecosystem-related concepts are relevant for competition law? So, for example, if there are multiple types of ecosystems, does this actually matter for the analysis or not? And what ecosystem-related behavior leads to anti-competitive effects? And how do we take account of the pro-competitive effects that at least the industrial policy discourse tends to suggest exists? And from that, I hope to extract some guidelines for what intervention we might have, if any at all. And my hope is, just to conclude, that I'll come up with a robust theory of ecosystems, and that I'll dream a little bigger than some other voices in the literature that seem to imply that the ecosystem is no more than a dead metaphor, and therefore not highly relevant. So, thank you all for your time, and I'm looking forward to your feedback.
Nice. Well, thanks so much for your presentation. Having read a lot about ecosystems as well, I know how messy this future can get. But my question is, and I was very much wondering, what the actual goal is that you're going towards? Because much of the ecosystem literature differs a lot on the goal that it's trying to achieve. So the innovation ecosystems are much about creation of value and the creation of innovation. And it looks at the ecosystem perspective from these interactions. Those were wondering, where are you going to, and how are you going to overlap that literature about other goals with your goal that you're trying to achieve here?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'm hoping that I can link it to the goal of competition law. So if ecosystems are value generators, then I hope that that becomes relevant for an analysis of health effects, whether, or for instance, at the justification stage. I didn't go into it very much, but I'm going to be looking at ecosystems from the perspective of the entire competition law, so not just 102, but also 101. And there might be also more relevant to best pro and cons, right? So how we balance.
It's from your position as other postcards, the defining the market is at a so is that also what you're trying to achieve?
I think that is one of the key challenges that's highlighted in the literature, and I'm not sure that I can talk about effects if I don't have a definition in the Netherlands market, at least not under Mark 2. So I have to touch upon it somehow.
And for one more question. On one of your slides it said, but for building the envisioned ecosystems, we could do an ecosystem, you have killer acquisitions under it, yeah, dat dan daar. En de Tilla meeste konden doen. How is a killer acquisition related to building ecosystem?
Yeah, I think a killer acquisition is a bit of a shorthand for me for indeed acquiring, not necessarily destroying, one for firing, which was the case in Canada, one acquired Incubate. But you can also enforce your ecosystem by acquiring competition at the margins and killing it, yes. And therefore you have more in your home environment. So
Jihan.
Station. I do have some interesting points. Maybe you're interested because I'm thinking in one of your slides is showing that the few companies, like top 6 companies, actually are from the US. So it would be interesting to look at other jurisdictions, to look at in US whether they already have something to regulate or to give some standard rules about the digital ecosystem. And second of all, I also think, in my impression, like in EU, I think European Union, European Commissions like to take harder rules in general. That's why, for me to understand, all these big platforms actually either come from US or they come from China. For instance, the WeChat. So maybe it's also nice to use an empirical study to interview the local companies which is get involved with digital ecosystem to ask how they think. And also maybe there's a good point to say whether also it's helpful to develop the local digital ecosystem companies or platforms within EU. So a balance of the harsh rules and competition law, and also to help with the innovation.
Thank you. That's really an interesting perspective, and I think actually China is a very good use case, because very respectfully, I think it reflects the Commission's fears that you will have one ecosystem, like the tech ecosystem, that controls all the aspects of Mayan society. So indeed, that could be an interesting comparison to draw. And yeah, I think interviews are not really methodology right now. I'm not sure if I'll able to get to that, but I'll think about it.
Well, Stephanie, time for confidence. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's I really like this video and I want to emphasize the 3 points that I really like. First, the color. I think was reason why I started being the culture. Some volunteers have the better presentation. Second, and just as my favorite, and then view conference test on the European is very because they're very clear about market and economic relevance, political relevance, social relevance, then politicalness, the research is important. And also, I am confident to be able to contribute skills. And I think that is because you show that very research is very comprehensive of the source. So I think it's really very important in literature and cases, as you mentioned. Sometimes cases seems to be really passive by literature, so that maybe proposed but it may be good to go.
Questions from the room? Yeah, please.
Yes, and more, I don't know, it just came up in my head about a piece like to a presentation, and also in the like for that you said. That's it's interesting to see this in from the US or Chinese ecosystems getting that here maybe in a way. And my thoughts I recall a class that I had on digitalization of enterprise. It was a big part of Lars is also directed from a business perspective on how businesses view these ecosystems as the way forward, and which was interpreting that actually took it very broad and helped real ways to understand these things. So if you would be interested, maybe I could share, sort of faster and see it maybe even be out. So.
Wolf, I think you had a question, and then John.
No, you sir.
No competition is.
So I really enjoyed the talk, and your slides are really nicely done. A couple of things. Does the concept of because in your last slide you said I don't want to do the pessimistic bit, but maybe it's worth testing out whether indeed the word ecosystem makes any difference at all, because a lot of the decisions you cite, I'm not so sure how much the Commission uses to drive. So one suggestion might be, if I use it, does it add value to the analysis? If I have to take it out, does it make a difference? So you don't have good or fitted there, but the Commission was quite able to do a merger analysis relative to the system. So once you have your definition, really test whether it has value. The other point I had was, you start with ecosystem and you move immediately to market power or to science. But I'm not so sure, so if there is a transition from the pipeline to the conglomerate to the ecosystem, it's not necessarily the case that an ecosystem must necessarily become foul. So maybe the things to be full out regularly.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, and I didn't mention it out loud, but I think on one of the slides, when we talk about the market definition, we also have the Petrobras case where the court talks about connected markets. So why aren't connected markets enough to solve the ecosystem problems? My intuition is a bit that it has to do with the scale of things, that maybe there are so many markets that we need to look at, and that they're connected in so many strange ways that a system market or ecosystem market might be better. But indeed, it's I want to be critical as I approach the topic, and not just to use what's there. And on going to economic power, that's a very valid point. That's why I also want to have a 101 component to the analysis. But also it's kind of shoehorned because a lot of it is under 102, and it's based on the fact that we define the ecosystem as the relevant market. Therefore, the orchestrator of the ecosystem naturally has the key role and emerges as a monopolist in that narrow definition. There's indeed something to look at, whether we're engineering the case of this.
And maybe more general reflection that we managed to deal with cases that were similar without having the concept of ecosystem, but also the idea that firms always function within an ecosystem even if they're not ecosystems themselves. So there's a broader concept of ecosystem as well, which may be relevant to the industrial policy dimension that was mentioned. Just a couple of observations. You say your output is going to be deciding what types of intervention are appropriate. I think you already suggest there would be some intermediate steps, and I think that would be important. For example, market definition of what specific theories of harm are relative to here. I think that they equally valuable as deciding what types of intervention you may not ultimately get there. When I start focusing on those intermediate steps, maybe work for it. And also like the industrial policy perspective that was handed to us at Presidency behind me just now. And I think what might be interesting is not just to focus on how to manage ecosystems or how to control them, but or how to build them, but on finding the balance between constructing and enabling, controlling and enabling ecosystems. So there has to be a balance between them in competition policy. It's not either or. So when do we go in which direction? How do you decide what will be just doing?
So it should be less about prohibiting ecosystem building, but more about policing the ecosystem.
Well, since we just been handed this perspective in Europe, we're now trying to develop the new type of industrial policy, and creating new European ecosystems might be a relevant dimension of that. So where you want to be somewhere in the middle, where on the one hand you want to promote them, on the other hand you want to control them, and that's these kind of reasonable balance and how they construct.
Final question from you. I think I see a pattern. You always want to molest us anybody. So,
Thank you. Okay, that big was the instruction. So I'm super proud to be your colleague. Compliments on the presentation. One question, on the wording of harms to exploiting the ecosystem. That kind of seems, maybe I'm wrong, like a contradiction in terms. When you look at harms to exploiting, because harms to building I can understand and it goes naturally, and harms to protecting I can understand, but then exploiting, in my mind, has a negative connotation. So I'm wondering what harms to exploiting the ecosystem means here.
Yeah, so I believe you use the word not in the sense of exploiting your dominant position, but more in extracting value from the thing that you created. And sometimes that can be done in an abusive way, which was exploited in genuinely the competitional sense. But the question is whether we can also benefit from the ecosystem which we built without harming the other participants.
It's suitable then to me, extracting value would be much more insightful. Yeah.
all right, big round of applause. Thank you so much.